You were born in Oxford to parents from India, grew up in California, currently live most of the time in Japan. You call yourself globalization on two legs, I believe. Pico won a King's Scholarship to Eton and then to Magdalen College, Oxford, where you graduated with a congratulatory double first in English and received the highest marks of any student in the university. Then you earned a master's degree also, a second one, in literature at Harvard, where you taught for a while, wrote for 2 years, taught writing and literature for 2 years. And Pico has written 9 books, including Video Night in Kathmandu, Lady and the Monk, Cuba and the Night, The Global Soul, and most recently, The Man Inside My Head. Did I get that right? I feel like I could.
Yeah, pure fiction. I'm delighted.
Published regularly in the New York Review of Books, Harper's, Tricycle, The Buddhist Review, Salon, Condé Nast, Traveler, and Time, where I remember reading you, long ago. You were named in 1995 alongside Noam Chomsky and Václav Havel as one of the 100 visionaries worldwide who could change your life. You are the foremost chronicler of globalization, at least to me, to many of your fans here. And globalization is this result of industrialization and mass media and commercialization. And all those things are very noisy. And so it's very interesting to me that while you are this foremost chronicler of globalization, you are a committed devotee of silence and quiet. What do you think about
Yeah, it does sound incongruous. Maybe I'm somebody who's taken in so much media and so much stimulation and so much movement that I've OD'd and sort of trying now to do a cold turkey program on myself. But you're right, there I was spending 2 weeks living in and around Los Angeles Airport, which is not a recipe for reflection, stillness and clarity. But doing things like that probably is part of what propelled me into rural Japan and into not feeling that I wanted to do without technology, but just that I need a balance. And that it's not, of course, that I distrust technology, but I distrust myself with it. As soon as there's a computer there, all I want to do is communicate with 7 billion people or enjoy the greatest entertainment center on earth. And once I do that, I suddenly find that I've disappeared and my life has disappeared, so I have to take forcible measures to remove myself and into a kind of monastic quiet. So that's the Thomas Merton part. But that quote is perfect because it catches both my interest in stillness and my interest in movement, and probably my sense that only each makes sense only in the context of the other.
Right. You couldn't move so much and absorb so much without imposing
Maybe.
some sort of
Yes, and I mean, I love your question. Nobody's ever asked me that before, but I think it's hard to get your head or your hand or your mind around the globe. And I found that the only way I can try, very feebly, to make sense of everything that's happening is really to take myself very far away from it and try to see the larger picture and put it on a big canvas and try to see the deeper patterns in some ways. Because I think more and more, I almost have the sensation that we're living about 2 inches away from the world, and we're catching it in all its intensity and excitement and vividness, but we can't, it's like standing very close to the screen and you can't begin to see what's really unfolding. But the screen is so intoxicating and the sensation of being 2 inches away is so exhilarating that we don't realize that it's coming in as gibberish to us, and we have to go to the back of this room really to get the full, I'm sure you have that sense that when you go to a movie or a certain kind of play, especially if it's visually exciting, you want to be far to the back.
Right.
When I go to the cinema, the worst seats are in the front. And it's the same kind of thinking, maybe. I mean, I feel like a fraud, actually, an imposter, because I'm a full-time journalist living in a little 2-room apartment in rural Japan, no TV, no high-speed internet, no car, no bicycle, no printer, no anything. But I try to justify it and say that I can see things in a slightly different way by doing that.
But now, how do you live without a cell phone in this age?
I know, it's like I've become James Bond in reverse. I was sure in your introduction you're going to say, most famous is the guy who doesn't have a cell phone.
I think that's why all these people came out tonight, to find out how you did it. How you do it.
Flash backwards, 1997, all of us are in exactly the same room. I'm sure none of us had a cell phone. Mm-hmm. In those days, I'd see them occasionally in Hong Kong and quite a bit in Tokyo, but none of my friends in this country had them. And we were all smiling the way we are now, enjoying the golden sunlight in UCLA, communicating very happily with our friends, I think, and taking in quite a lot of information about the pre-Kardashians or whatever the equivalent was, O.J. Simpson maybe. I wonder, everyone in this room lived very happily without a cell phone. And, I understand that parents, for example, it's a great mechanism for making sure your children are safe and vice versa, and that most of us in this room couldn't do our jobs without email. But I think in some ways we've sort of got caught up in this accelerating cycle that's getting faster and faster and faster, and now so many people are almost getting dizzy and getting a headache, like kids who keep on eating one tortilla chip after another and suddenly wonder why they've got a stomachache. And I notice more and more of my friends, often the most wired ones, are trying to meet it out or trying to forge some kind of balance because they feel they're ODing. We're on this roller coaster that's run away with us almost.
So those internet holidays, a weekend off, or the ranch you write about that costs thousands of dollars a night, where people go and don't have a television.
Exactly. $2,200 a night not to have a TV in your room. And so many of my writer friends, and I know there are lots of writers in this room, exulting in freedom and 4 or 5 other kinds of software that are aimed to disable the internet for 8 hours. And the same writers who 5 years ago were so excited to have all this information at their disposal. And I think the thing that most strikes me is that the people closest to the heart of the technology revolution are the ones who seem to be most wise and sensitive to the need for limits. Technology gives us wonderful sense of possibility and freedom, but we need to create limits or else we just get engulfed in it. And so I have a friend called Kevin Kelly, for example, who helped found Wired magazine. He's one of the great technological visionaries of Silicon Valley.
Yes.
He doesn't have a smartphone, he doesn't have a PDA, he doesn't have a telephone, a TV in his house. He never travels with a laptop. And he spends a lot of his time making sure that his children actually encounter the world one-on-one. So he sees how technology is radically liberating us and expanding our horizons, but he also sees that if we don't strike the right kind of dialogue with it, we disappear inside it and get consumed by the things we think we're consuming. I just heard from him yesterday, by chance, by email, of course, but he was saying, I'm spending 2 months here in the villages of Asia. And so I think, in that sense, I also, like many people here, I walked past the Googleplex. I went to visit the Google Center, and it's so interesting there to see the meditation rooms, the playgrounds, the trampolines, all the devices by which Google registers that the only way they can create the best technology is by being in kind of a black hole in some ways. And I've noticed, you probably know more about this than I do, but in business schools now, I was just talking to Wharton at Penn, the great new fashion is mindfulness. And
Yes.
even the people most attentive to the bottom line know that it's only by switching off for a while that they, in fact, they can maximize what they bring to their job. Intel, this is the last example, otherwise we'll be here all night, but Intel actually imposed on 400 of its executives and engineers 4 hours of quiet time every Tuesday morning. Not allowed to make telephone calls, not allowed to handle email, because recent studies have found the average office worker only gets 3 uninterrupted minutes at a time. And of course, all of those 400 workers instantly became much more productive and suggested that the program would be extended across the company.
And those are the people making the chips that engine the computers that mesmerize us. It's easy to say that we want to step back from it, but I think a lot of people find it very difficult, the way people find it difficult to buck the trends generally. And you have been going to a monastery for longer than there was perhaps email. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to go and take these monastic retreats, if you will, for so many years now?
I mean, I can probably talk much too much about that, but
I think that's what they want.
Amazingly and perfectly, I was introduced to it by a friend who teaches high school in Santa Barbara. And he said, like many a teacher, he dealt every year with the predicament of what to do with restless, hormone-addled, testosterone-crazed 15-year-old boys. And he decided every spring to take them up to this Catholic hermitage in Big Sur for 3 days. And he found very quickly, even the most fidgety and sort of Ritalin candidate 15-year-old boy felt calmer, felt clearer, and felt so much happier that after a couple of nights, many of the boys never wanted to come down. And I thought anything that worked for 15-year-old boys should work with me. So I got into the car outside my mother's house and drove, and that beautiful Route 1 with ever fewer cars, and then just meadows on one side of you and the great ocean on the other side, and lighthouses here and there. And in 3.5 hours, I arrived at this place, 1,300 feet above the ocean, and I got out of my car. And I know at least one friend here who's been many times too. And there was this pulsing silence. And the silence was not really the absence of noise. It was the presence of a kind of invigorating energy. And I should stress, I'm not a religious person. I'm a profane journalist. And I'm not a Catholic, and I'm not necessarily a hermit. But I went into my room, and there was a long desk against a huge window leading down to 1,200, 1,300 feet of coastal live oak and eucalyptus trees, and then the great blue expanse of the Pacific in front of me. I instantly realized that there's nothing more luxurious than just being in one place. And as you say, this was before email was in my life, but just being away from a telephone and being away from a computer. And it's interesting because the house that I was leaving to go to the monastery is at the same elevation. My mother lives 1,300 feet above Santa Barbara, looking over the ocean, in a house that couldn't seem more remote and secluded and tranquil to anybody looking at it. But of course, when I'm in that house, when I'm writing, a part of me is always braced for that little chime of "you've got mail," "you've got mail." And when I'm trying to read, a part of me knows that the phone could ring at any moment. And if I'm sitting out at night looking under the stars, I realize I'm missing Jeopardy or the Lakers games or a million exciting diversions. And so one way or another, I'm always not entirely there. And when I was in my little room in the monastery, a Stella's jay would alight on this splintered fence. It would seem like an extraordinary moment, and all my attention would be there. And when all your attention is on something, even on this bottle, you see pretty much everything you need to see right there. A bell would toll 3-4 times a day, and it felt like it was tolling, inside me, not around me. I would just take walks up and down, looking at the stars, seeing the same landscape I could really see at home, and yet at home I would never see it. I would just walk past it. And so it very quickly became almost my secret addiction, and I started going more and more often, and then I'd actually stay in the cloisters if all the retreatants' rooms were full. And I suppose the other thing to be stressed about it is that every time I go there, and I'm going again in a few days, there are a million reasons not to go. I feel bad about abandoning my mother and my friends, and 15 editors are coming to me with deadlines and fact-checking questions. You know how that is. And I'm going to miss the Green Day concert in Santa Barbara. And I can so easily argue myself out of this. And as soon as I go there, I wonder why I ever had questions, because I know that when I come back, I'm going to have so much more to bring to my mother and my friends and whatever concerts I do see, and indeed to my bosses as well. Well, there's a famous moment from Gandhi's life where he said apparently one day, this is going to be a really, really busy day. There's no way I can meditate for 1 hour. I've got to meditate for 2. And at some level, I find the busier your life, the more fruitful it is to step away from it. And the deeper that you can collect yourself, so to speak, the deeper is the work you're going to do. And that's why, of course, business people go on retreats, and people who want to get a lot done step away from their desks. But initially it seems counterintuitive, and it's hard to do. You feel that you're being delinquent, when in fact I'd say you're being responsible, and taking a retreat is really a way of advancing towards what you care about. It's a way of finding out what is really closest to you.
But a lot of people find that absolutely terrifying. They might understand you logically. Yes, that makes sense. Yes, I should go exercise for an hour. But how many people find excuses not to take time for themselves? Every woman I know who's got kids and has a hard time making time for themselves, much less stepping that far away. There's something terrifying about silence to a lot of people.
There is. And I suppose my simple, perhaps irresponsible answer is that if that mother is caught up in the kids and racing around 16 hours a day, what she's going to be giving those kids is something fidgety, distracted, fractured, all over the place. And if she were to be brave enough, and as you say, it takes courage to step away for 30 minutes, I think then she could bring much more radiance and calm, and they would instantly feel, kids being very sensitive, the difference in their mom, and actually be grateful that she'd taken those 30 minutes off. And of course, I don't suggest that people go to a monastery, but I do find so many of my friends now do want to do something very specific, whether it's go for a run or cook or meditate or do Tai Chi or something, just to collect themselves and to be able to think and not to think. And oddly enough, I was on a radio program with one of your colleagues talking about this, and all the call-ins were from people much younger than myself, because I realize I sound like an old fogey who's 60 years out of date, and I am. But I'm guessing that if I'm feeling all this, if I were 20 years old, there'd be that much more coming in on me. And although it'd be second nature and habitual, a part of me would be crying out for silence. And almost every one of the call-ins was from somebody of university age who's saying, I know exactly what you're saying and more so. And I decided, to not to do this for an hour a day or to take an internet Sabbath for every weekend. And the host of the show said his own 17-year-old daughter decided to go off Facebook because she realized, that she might not have a life if she stayed on Facebook. I read recently about a Sacramento teenager who handles 300,000 text messages every month. That's impressive. That means 10,000 a day. And if she's awake 16 hours a day, 10 every waking minute of every day for a month.
It's a constant stream coming into your brain, never a moment to step back.
And of course, it's partly an addiction. So we do have internet apnea now. We have this new disease, nomophobia, which is literally being terrified of being outside mobile phone contact. Real disease. Read Hamlet's Blackberry by William Powers describes it. Internet rescue camps in China and Korea where kids literally have to be taken away from the screen and given cold turkey by people other than themselves. And you're right, because I suffer exactly the same thing, because I realize if I don't check my emails today, they're not going to go away. There'll be just twice as much to take care of tomorrow. So it's a really hard thing. But at some point, I thought to myself, if I go to this monastery 4 times a year for 3 days each, that comes to 3% of the days of the year, really minuscule. And it radically illuminates and transforms the other 97%. Or if that mother takes 30 minutes of the day off, that's only 3% of her waking day and 2% of the entire day. So it seems monumental to us when you actually think about what it involves. But in the larger scheme of things, it's a small investment with potentially a big payoff.
I remember when I first realized the best writing you can do is walking away from the computer, stepping away from staring and working so hard or trying so hard to work was really liberating.
You're wise. It took me 25 years of writing to see that, but I believe it so entirely now. And I think the other thing that I should stress, and you are much more an expert on this than I, is that when we travel, the closed or impoverished or imprisoned countries in the world, of course technology is only a blessing for them because it brings them the sense of freedom and information and possibility and data that they don't have access to otherwise. It's just we in a room like this who are relatively awash in choice and data, who perhaps don't need as much as we think. But I remember in your wonderful book about Bhutan, I mean, that's the perfect example of many things, including the fact that you can't legislate too much, but that when you went to Bhutan and helped them set up a radio station, I'm sure you found they were so excited to have this connection at last, first time in their history.
You're very generous, and it's very nice to be able to be connected. It's the same thing with a road. It's wonderful to have a road when you don't have one, but then when you have a network of roads, and you so movingly describe what the very simple technology of an airplane does in terms of fracturing our souls, and it allows us to expand our lives. But in one place, in one of these great collections of your essays, I've been reading about just you're leaving your mother and going back to Japan, and even just something, that kind of basic technology, which we forget about when we consider email and smartphones and all of that, has both illuminated our lives, expanded them, but also given us a sense of loss, too.
So I must say, and to frame everything I have been saying, I couldn't live the way I do without technology, as your question suggests. And I'm so grateful for planes that living in rural Japan, I can be next to my mother in less than 24 hours, and she's 81 years old. And I think all of us have these secret homes. We have some culture far away from us, Egypt, China, Japan, India, Persia, that we have an affinity with. And in our grandparents' days, they could just have dreamed about those places and read about them. And on our parents' day, maybe they could have visited occasionally. But now, thanks, as you said, to emails and phones, I can live, as I have done for 25 years on a tourist visa in Japan. I've never been a grown-up there, but I can communicate with my bosses and friends in New York and London through these machines. So I think none of us wants to go backwards and uninvent them. We don't want to be ruled by them, I suppose.
You learned this, too, at a very early age, and in your new book you write a lot about the sort of pull you felt when your parents moved to California. I mean, Santa Barbara, what could be more spectacular than that, and how you calculated to go back to England to go to school. So the image of you as a little boy recognizing that you were this global soul and that you did want feet in various places is so powerful for me.
Yes, that I would make my home in the state of passage.
Yes.
That I would be formed in some ways not just by England or by California, but by the constant movement back and forth from the age of 9, looking at England through Californian eyes and looking at California through English eyes, and noticing how all my English friends had one dream in life, and that was to be in Esalen with the Grateful Dead playing and Joni Mitchell running around. And some of my friends in Santa Barbara wanted to be in a 15th century cloister with Gregorian chants sounding. And so seeing the ways cultures project their longings and hopes and insufficiencies, perhaps, on other cultures, which has been, as you say, the same thing that I've been writing about ever since. And again, that was possible in a different way, I suppose, when people, the age of horse and carriage or the age of trains, but it certainly accelerated. And it was interesting, as a little boy, when I went to school and got off the plane, I was, I think, almost the only boy in my school of 1,000 boys coming by plane. And now if you went to that same school, there might be 200 or 250. And there's this whole tribe really growing up, which is the tribe of the modern century and the honorary citizens of Toronto and Sydney and Hong Kong and LA and New York, who belong in many places at once, and for whom home is almost a work in progress, and that home has nothing to do with a piece of soil. It's more a piece of soul that they carry around with them, like snails with portable homes. And that home isn't really the place where you're born, but it's the place where you become yourself. Home's not where you sleep, it's where you stand. So I think it's really interesting that for me, when I was doing that in the 60s, it seemed such an unusual thing. And now, especially I'm sure on a campus like UCLA, half the kids I see would have an association with one culture through their parents, and another with their boyfriends, and another with Los Angeles, and another with the country they want to they're dreaming of, and their whole life will be having home as a work in progress and taking pieces of lots of different cultures and piecing them together like a kind of stained glass pattern.
I want to talk more about travel, but I want to talk with you about the Dalai Lama, because this ties so well to the general theme we've got here, but also in one of the essays you'd written, and it probably comes up in the book too, although I didn't reread it for tonight, the book. You talk about how so in other words, this is from maybe 15 years ago that you had first started writing about him, 20 years. He was addicted to listening to the BBC World Service.
Yes.
So the image of the Dalai Lama, and you write even back then about the influence, the Western influence on his, from when you first met him when he would namaste to then now he's more shaking of hands. And I guess let's start by talking about your long affiliation with the Dalai Lama, how he's got a pet name for you, just how he's influenced you, because I can't imagine spending that much time with anybody who wouldn't influence you, especially if it was the Dalai Lama.
Yes, well again, so much to say. I was very lucky because my father, who was a professional philosopher, met the Dalai Lama as soon as the Dalai Lama came into exile in 1959, so I really inherited that connection. I first met the Dalai Lama and went to see him in Dharamsala in 1974, so I've now spent 38 years talking and traveling with him, and I spend a week crossing Japan with him every November. And I love those examples you cite, because I think one thing that may not always be obvious, he's a hyper-realist. Because he's been head leader of his people for 72 years, since the age of 4, he's never been in a position of being able to entertain romantic or wishy-washy or abstract ideas. He's always had to be really in the real world. And I think the great blessing of his life is having a man of monastic clarity and a larger vision in the heart of realpolitik, and bringing that into the White House and the European Parliament and theoretically Beijing and everywhere else too. As I say, very, very practical. So even as a little boy in the Potala Palace, famously, all he wanted to do was get news of the outside world. And set up newsreels whereby he could follow World War II. His great gift, I think, is for science. And I think he's mostly a scientist of the mind. And I think one of the ways that he's taught me, because I'm not a Buddhist, too lazy for that, is his most recent book is Beyond Religion. And one disarming thing about him for a religious leader is that he'll come here. In fact, I once had dinner with his brother in this very building a few years ago. And when His Holiness comes to Los Angeles, he tells people, please don't become Buddhists. Stay within your own traditions where there's no danger of misinterpretation. But you have something maybe you can learn from a Buddhist, and you certainly have something you can teach to a Buddhist. But his most recent book is called Beyond Religion, in which he says it doesn't even matter if you have religion in your life. The most fundamental thing is kindness and responsibility towards the people around you. And in fact, in my most recent book, on Graham Greene, for me it was very much a sequel to the book about the Dalai Lama, because I see them as really almost about the same vision, which I would say is compassionate realism. In other words, looking at the world exactly as it is, in a very undiluted way, but still finding moments of possibility and hope and faith in it. In Graham Greene's work, you always sense that kindness is much more important than doctrine. What you do is more important than what you believe or what you don't believe. And I think the Dalai Lama has that very bracing, universal, secular vision. And it's nice to see a religious leader who's not trying to proselytize, but rather the opposite, and who, when he comes to this country, wants to learn from the Hopis and the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, and in fact has delivered a long series of lectures on the Gospels with tears rolling down his cheeks as he reads about some of the miracles that Jesus performed. And in terms of technology, I think maybe one of the main things I've learned from the Dalai Lama is that in ancient Buddhist thought, as many of you probably know, there's something called Indra's net, which means the web of interconnectedness, whereby the business of anyone is the business of everybody else. We're all interconnected. If I do something terrible right now, you're going to be a victim of it, and I am, and everybody else is. And of course, the internet is a perfect metaphor, example, and vessel for that. And so the Dalai Lama, for 40 years, has really been talking about globalization before any of us even knew the word, and saying that we're all part of one body. And that, for example, if our country were to attack Iran tomorrow, one of the first victims would be our country, because we're dependent on Iran and its neighbors in many ways, and that anything that China does to help Tibet will help China, and anything that Tibet does to hurt China is going to hurt Tibet. Mm-hmm. And that if you see China as the right arm and Tibet as the left arm, for either to attack each other is as senseless as for me to punch myself in the arm. And nowadays, I think Bono and the Dalai Lama's great friend Desmond Tutu and Bill Gates and many others can see things in this larger picture. We know that many days of the year, 25% of the pollution here in LA comes from China. Yes. If the markets collapse tomorrow in Singapore, the consequences will be felt 3 minutes later in New York or London. So we're ever more aware of how knit together our destinies are. But from the Dalai Lama's point of view, this all has a philosophical basis. And so he's been working with that assumption all along, which of course has helped him a lot.
If only he could explain to people that when they're talking on their cell phone or texting in their cars, that has a deleterious effect on other people too. But
yes, except that he's really in favor of communication. And it's interesting, I spent time in the Himalayas as you have. I went to Tibet first in 1985 when it looked exactly as you would hope Lhasa would, a little cluster of two-story whitewashed houses under the shadow of the Patala Palace. I went back in this century, 658 brothels on the main street alone by one Western scholar's count. The city occupies 20 times as much space as in 1950. Blue glass shopping malls everywhere. It looks like Las Vegas. And for most parts of the city, you can't even see the Patala Palace. But because the Dalai Lama is such a realist, when I talk about these things with him, he says, yeah, but Tibet was much too isolated before. And we needed some of those material and modern developments. And we should, in fact, be grateful to the People's Republic of China for bringing these developments that we need. And economically, Tibet is really lucky to be part of this fast-rising powerhouse. Though he also, of course, says, well, in gaining these modern developments, do we have to lose a unique culture, religion, and language? But he's always in favor of communication, probably even in the form of cell phone. He does tweet. And though I read, I think last week in Sports Illustrated, LeBron James has a few more followers than the Dalai Lama, but they're kind of neck and neck. I think they're both at the 4 million level, pretty much.
I don't believe the Dalai Lama does the tweets himself. Do you?
He doesn't do it himself. You're right. Not. And he's not recording the Pacers game as we speak either, as LeBron probably is.
If the Dalai Lama tweets, the Pope tweets, I know it, right?
Yes. I mean, the Dalai Lama, he wrote an introduction to a book on the internet a few years ago, but the fact of the matter is he's so busy that he doesn't have time. Maybe to go back to part of where we began our conversation, the thing I noticed about him, so I follow him every hour of his working day from 7:30 in the morning to 5:30 in the afternoon. I sit in on all his meetings and I attend all his meals and go to every private conference he has. And by the end of the day, I'm exhausted. And he is 77 years old in July, 22 years older than I am, and never seems to get tired. And I think the one thing that can keep him zipping around the world and so alert and so present wherever he is that he begins every day with 4 hours of meditation. And it must be said, during those 4 hours of meditation, as you pointed out, he is in part listening to the BBC World Service. 5 a.m. every morning in Dharamsala, it's turned on, and he will gleefully acknowledge that. But still, just 4 hours of sitting still And then when he comes out of his room at 7:30, after having already done 4 hours, he's ready. I mean, he is alight and electric and ready to take on the world. And I think without those 4 hours, it would be very difficult. And since he met Thomas Merton in 1968, he's expressed wistfulness and ruefulness that he's never had enough time to really deepen his spiritual practice as he might have been able to do in other circumstances. But conversely, he's brought the fruits of those 4 hours into the heart of Hollywood and the heart of Washington.
You say he's entered the celebrity age to fulfill his monastic duties. Yeah. Multitasking, what do you have to say about that?
29% of the average office day is lost, and even in 2009 through multitasking. And I gather the losses across corporations came to 900 billion in 2009. It must be 3 times that much now. And I suppose there's just the sense if you're trying to do many things at once, and I'm often in that state, you're not really doing any of them. And the average American, 8.5 hours in front of a screen every day now. So that's a lot.
Yes, yeah.
And so we're paying more than rich justice to that side of our lives, I think.
Somewhere in my readings, you quote Pascal from the 17th century, though, which made me feel better that people have always been distracted. Distraction's the only thing that consoles us for our miseries, and yet it is the greatest of our miseries. All man's problems come from his inability to sit quietly in a room alone.
Yeah, which is a variation of the corn chip phenomenon. Eating more and more corn chips, and then you're getting sick, and you think, well, the cure is more corn chips, and end up more sick. So it's very hard to break those habits. It's hard for me as for anyone, I think.
A little bit more on the Dalai Lama, or didn't reveal his nickname for you.
It was Pinocchio. Not because I'm deceitful, but I think the size of my nose may have something to do with it.
So sweet. It's not anymore. He's changed it.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I'll keep the new name to myself.
You wrote the last one down, so
yeah,
you blew
that's
it.
True.
Sorry. But it's interesting because your given name is not Pico.
It's Siddhartha, the name of the Buddha. So I think my father was prophetic, and I met on my way into the auditorium a gentleman who knew my father. Almost at the time he was naming me, and heard all kind. He knows more about my father's choice of my name than I do because he heard my father explain it. But it is interesting that part of the wisdom of my father, I realize only now, was giving me this great global name. So I do have Siddhartha, Indian name, as my first name, the Buddha's name, and my father's name is my third name. But so wise to give me this name Pico, after an Italian Neoplatonist philosopher, but it could pass for belonging to any language, and everybody can spell it, everybody can say it. In Los Angeles, I never have to spell it out for anybody. So maybe my father intuited something about the kind of life that I might be leading.
One of the many themes in your book is monasticism, Buddhism, of course, with the Dalai Lama, the book you wrote about the Dalai Lama, but just in general. So it's interesting to me that what didn't, quote unquote, rub off was your becoming religious in any way.
I've gained so much from religious presences, but I think I take seriously when the Dalai Lama says to people, if you're born in another tradition, feel free to learn from Buddhism, but don't seize onto it too quickly, because your roots are probably much deeper where you are. Even if my roots are in midair or in Los Angeles airport. And I think the Tibetans say, better to dig one 40-foot ditch than 10 4-foot ditches. And I think that's part of it. He doesn't want to encourage a salad bar approach where take a little bit from Judaism and a little bit from Islam and the like. And partly I think I also learned from seeing the Dalai Lama what very, very hard work is involved and what a serious commitment it is to call yourself a Buddhist. It's not just a tag that you can attach to yourself. And I haven't made that full-fledged commitment, so I haven't earned it.
What do you think your father was getting at by calling you Siddhartha? What do you think he wanted from
Well, he was very interested in comparative religions. So he was probably keen that this Hindu little boy should have literally a Christian name and a Buddhist name. And in that way, preparing me very well for this new order that we find ourselves in.
But not necessarily going out and renouncing everything. He didn't expect you to renounce everything the way Siddhartha did.
Well, I did leave my job when I was 29, and he wasn't so happy about that actually. But it's an interesting thing, maybe because I will say, and I don't want to talk too much about your book, except I really resonated to the beginning of your book when you described how, in your very, very busy job and right in the heart of the communications world, you decided to go to one of the most serene and pristine, unspoiled, unnoisy places in the world. And that's exactly what happened to me, because there I was in my mid-20s. I was writing, I had pretty much the life I might have dreamed of as a little boy. I had an apartment on Park Avenue. I was writing world affairs articles for Time magazine. And in those days, half the writers went around the world covering the news, and the other half, like myself, just sat in little cubicles in Rockefeller Center and wrote the pieces from our colleagues' reports that appeared in the magazine. And then I made 3 fatal mistakes. The first was to actually go on holiday, my first year on the job, to see some of the places I was writing about, which I'd never seen before. The second was that I chose Southeast Asia, dangerously irresistible part of the world, Thailand, Burma, and Hong Kong. And the third, which is perhaps most surprising, is that at the end of that trip, I had a one-night layover in Narita Airport. Japan Airlines put me up for a night while I was waiting for my flight back to New York City. It was an early afternoon flight, so I had a few hours free that morning, and I figured Narita is probably more or less like Inglewood or like Queens around JFK, but I've got nothing else to do. So I took the shuttle bus into the little town of Narita. And it was a late October day with the brilliance and crispness of the early autumn in Japan, where it's absolutely blue and cloudless, but there's a first sense of chill and dark and the cold of winter coming in. And just something about the way little kids were playing around in a park next to the temple, and the way the shoes were lined up neatly outside these tatami restaurants with this crystalline glass looking out on the turning leaves, and just the polished stillness in the air pierced me with such a sense of familiarity. I thought, somehow or other, though I've never set foot in Japan before, I know this better than I know the street I grew up on Oxford, or the house where I keep all my things in Santa Barbara. So by the time I got onto my plane to fly back to New York City, I decided to move to Japan. And indeed, Siddhartha-like, at a very base and unexalted level, at the age of 29, I left the Gilded Palace, as I saw it, Rockefeller Center, to go and live in the monastery in Kyoto. And even though my year in a monastery in Kyoto lasted only a week, because it was exactly like all the boarding schools, I'd put in too much time in. When you think of a monastery in Kyoto, when you're sitting on 6th Avenue in New York, you see the full moon and you see yourself sitting on a platform composing haiku. When you get there, it's scrubbing floors and washing dishes and sweeping leaves, and it's menial stuff that's really, it's all about discipline. So I bailed out after a week, but 25 years later, I still live next to Kyoto, and as you can tell from what I was saying before, in a 2-room apartment's probably more monastic than the room I had in the monastery. And so there was the intuition I was following wasn't a bad one. And I somehow knew that was my home, and that living and working 4 blocks away from Times Square, and you felt this, I think, when in your job, gave me a wonderful glimpse at certain aspects of the official, stimulated, mediated public world. But there was a whole other side to life that I couldn't see there, and that I needed to complement my life in New York City with a life in a quiet space in Kyoto. And so I still go, as we were saying, back and forth between them. But I did unwittingly and clumsily follow in those footsteps, I suppose, of not the ideal career move at 29 to leave Rockefeller Center and go to a backstreet monastery.
But you didn't love New York. Everything I've read you write about New York, you can always tell in your polite way that
Really?
it's not one of your favorite places.
Oh, well, I like it now. Maybe that's the virtue of living in Japan. You can get to love New York again, and it's great. It's great to have the stimulation. I probably need more stimulation in my life now. But
A lot of people feel that way about Los Angeles. So
yes.
they love it when they're not here. So I think we'll start taking questions in just a second. Are we okay on the audio? I'm worried that there's a little bit of a hum. No, you're okay? Good, sorry.
I've given such long answers. You have so many questions, and I haven't given you a chance to...
No, I've got... No.
All right.
No. I think we've covered almost everything I thought was very interesting, and also, there's so many things to talk about with you, but Leonard Cohen at the Mount Baldy Zen Center.
Thank you. I was just about to talk about it. It escaped my mind, and then we got off into Pico and got diverted from the central theme, which was that so much of my writing, of course, has been about Leonard Cohen and the Dalai Lama, because essentially both of them are monks in the world. And the Dalai Lama is a monk who spent his whole time traveling. And wherever he goes, he asks 2 questions. What can I learn from this place, and what can I give to this place? Which seems like a good model for any traveler.
Yes.
And of course, the Leonard Cohen is the ultimate man of the world who chose, having exhausted the world's pleasures and seen through it in many ways, to become a fully ordained Zen monk. And yes, I first got to know him when he was up at Mount Baldy Monastery. And it goes back just to the heart of where we started with this conversation, because when we think, as you said, how frightening and dangerous and difficult it is to unplug, every now and then I think, well, I'm a writer, And if I think of the writers that I really admire, or who seem to be absolutely revolutionary now, Cormac McCarthy, Thomas Pynchon, Annie Dillard, Marilyn Robinson, Don DeLillo, all of them are essentially recluses. And the way that they're constructing these absolutely unique visions, radical visions, just the same way as the Google engineers in their little meditation rooms are coming up with these great new inventions, is by being a very, very far distance from the world. And Leonard Cohen, somebody on my way into the auditorium, very kindly gave me a rendition of his song, Hallelujah. Leonard Cohen is a perfect example. There he is, age 77, number 1 on the Billboard charts earlier this year, a global sensation. And I'm guessing that the reason so many of us here, but every corner of the world, from Kyoto to Singapore to Poland, listen to him, is that we sense that there's a wisdom there. And it's a wisdom that comes from having stepped out of the world. He lives in the heart of Los Angeles. He could have access to any person or any world that he chooses. But he has decided to step away from all of that, to plumb something much more ageless, and to put a much huger frame around the events of the day. And so when he writes, sings democracy, or when he surveys the passing scene, we feel that he's seeing it in a much more expansive and spacious and deeper light than most of the singers or even writers that we're otherwise familiar with. And I must say, it's humbling to visit Leonard Cohen. He's the only person I know in California. Most of my friends are like me, in other words, impoverished writers. But he lives in a poorer, more modest, more humble home than any of my friends in California, in an area so dangerous there are bars on the windows, the pizza places won't deliver there. He shares the house with his daughter, and there's no degree of affectation there. He is living the life. And I once took my Japanese wife up to Mount Baldy, and she was born and grew up in Kyoto and has grown up entire life with Zen practice. And when she saw the way he was sitting in doing his zazen, she said, wow, this is the monk to end all monks. Every other monk there was 30 years old. He was already in his 60s. And just from his posture and the clarity and the concentration of his black-robed form against the tatami mat, she realized, even though she can't stand his music, what a formidable presence there was. And so it's a wonderful and liberating idea that this man who's written so much and sung so much and seen so much would realize that the greatest adventure, as he put it to me, was being in the monastery. And he called religion the most voluptuous experience that he had known in life. And one of the other moving things about him, of course, many of you probably know this, is that he spends all his time right now, in fact, with his Zen teacher of 40 years, who's 105 years old. And his Zen teacher speaks maybe 6 words of English, as far as I can tell. Leonard speaks, I think, no words of Japanese. And yet they have this deep communication and this really profound friendship. And I think Leonard Cohen has found in his teacher a friend who, as he says, will forgive him everything, understand everything, to the point where they don't need to speak. And when I talk about silence, I think that's part of the reason I went to Japan. And I'm so grateful to Japan, because I think more than most cultures I know, it's a place that functions and lives with and through silence. And the ideal Japanese conversation seems to me one in which you have as few words as possible. And the Japanese are very, very good at listening, and often not very enthusiastic about talking. And the whole place is set up around this idea of nonverbal communication. Just as the empty tatami room, the haiku where it's mostly white space on the page. In fact, this most recent book that I wrote, I might have told you already, I wrote 3,000 fully fact-checked, proofread, polished pages, and then I took 2,760 out, and I just published 3% of, or however many percent it is, 10% maybe, of the pages I'd written, so that there would be as much space, empty space, as possible for the reader to try to fill. But it was an attempt to honor that Japanese aesthetic, but certainly in the sense of doing without words. If you just deliver one word in Japan, it carries much more impact than the thousands of words I've just been babbling at you. But it's a great gift. And for those of us who grew up in places like California or England, and it's a tonic thing to learn, how much you can communicate without words.
I just want to ask you about the fact that you did marry a Japanese woman, and that, given what you've just said, not an accident, right? That you fell in love with a woman who was is Japanese.
Not an accident. Clever intuition in Narita Airport in 2 hours summoned me to Japan. Also must have meant that I could only marry a Japanese woman, and I have at least 2 friends in this auditorium who have Japanese wives. So there's a nice little tribe of us here. But one of the interesting things that takes many people back is that my wife speaks fairly limited English, I would say like a 6-year-old. And I speak much more limited Japanese. I speak like a 2-year-old girl, basically, since the only Japanese I've learned is from listening to her. And in Japan, the man's language and the woman's language is very different. And yet, as with Leonard and his teacher, in 25 years, I've never had communications problems. And I seriously, it sounds like a glib or facetious thing, but I feel I have much greater communications problems in Santa Barbara than I do in Japan. Partly, of course, because of the illusion of the common language, that we're two countries divided by a single language. And I don't know, maybe all kinds of other factors. We assume that we're understanding each other better than we really do, though that commute that I made back and forth as a little boy really made me feel that England and America are different centuries, different planets from one another. And I was going back and forth between 1441 and 1968 then, and they're at least as separated still, I believe. Whereas anyone who grows up in England, I think, understands Japan as a small-scaled, hierarchical culture where people don't say what they mean, and you don't know how much distance there is between what they say and what they're really thinking. But it's certainly the diametrical opposite from California. But in the absence of words, I feel my friends and neighbors in Japan understand me wonderfully, especially my wife, who's really my only editor. She's never read a word that I've written. But if I have, like with my Graham Greene book, whenever I was thinking it out, she's the only person I would turn to for guidance. Because she was reading me, even though she's never read my words. And she's reading me way better than anybody else, partly, I think, because she is Japanese. And because, you know, if I were to visit your house and you were Japanese, ask me what kind of tea I like, and I say Earl Grey, then 15 years later, if I came to your house again, you would have the Earl Grey ready. Because all your attention would be on making me comfortable and what my needs were. Not on pushing one's own needs upon the other person. And whether it's a Japanese man or a Japanese woman, I think they're very advanced in that way in terms of thinking of the larger whole and defining their identity in terms of something much bigger than their single, vulnerable selves. I've learned a lot from Japan as well as Dalai Lama or Leonard Cohen. You've done a wonderful job of invoking all my inspirations.
Something that Leonard Cohen told you that I wanted to just get you to comment on. He said, the older you get, the lonelier you become, and the deeper the love that you need.
Isn't that beautiful? One of the bracing things about visiting him in his monastic cabin was I saw the notebooks line up, 80 notebooks of his poems, and he will work 10 years on a single song, such as Anthem. He wrote 80 verses for Hallelujah, and he recorded 4. And yet, he's the most articulate writer I've ever met. And so he would just, as we're talking, as we are now, he would come out with sentences like that, just resonant sentences that come from the deep and come from, it sounds like he's an Old Testament prophet walking the streets of Jerusalem almost. And I think that again is a register and a reflection of all that time he spent alone. I would visit his cabin at 2 in the morning and the light was on, and like the Dalai Lama in his different way, he was sitting there contemplating things. And that means that one of the things I most love about monks, in fact, including in Big Sur when I visit them, they have no ums and ers. Their sentences are beautifully rounded. They're more articulate than anyone. And yet, behind the seeming simplicity, there is so much depth and complexity in their sentences because they come out of years of silence. And they're like little pebbles drawn up from a very deep well. And I think that's a perfect example. And I've thought about that sentence more and more as my years go on, and I think about what it means.
I wanted to ask, earlier you mentioned the Dalai Lama meditates for 4 hours and listens to the BBC.
Yes.
Does he listen to the BBC the entire 4 hours?
Good question. No, I think it's only 20 or 30 minutes, but it's a very counterintuitive notion to us. But I think Tibetan meditation, as I understand it, is very different from Zen meditation. So, for example, when Leonard Cohen meditates, he just sits like that and doesn't move for 45 minutes or however long. Whereas the Dalai Lama moves all the time, and he's opening his eyes and he's closing his eyes, and he's reciting various things, and he's going through certain prayers, and he's doing his rosaries, and it's a very dynamic, active thing. There's a beautiful book by a Swiss photographer called Manuel Bauer, who followed the Dalai Lama around into his meditation chamber included for years and years. And he has extremely powerful photographic sequences showing the Dalai Lama meditating. And it's like, is it a stop-action film? It's equivalent to, anyway, you see him in permanent movement while he's meditating. But the BBC report is only a brief segment. And I realize, actually, he does 4 hours of meditation at the beginning of the day. But he once took me through his full day. And he said, well, I do 4 hours of meditation, and I do some office work, and then there's some more meditation, and then I see visitors, and then there's some more meditation, and I do some reading of text, and then some more meditation. And I worked out in the space of a whole day, it could be 8 hours when he's at home. But certainly the initial 4 hours are like the sounding of the bell before his activities in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What do you think about this idea of loneliness versus being alone? You've written a lot about how you are lucky to enjoy being alone.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have a very difficult time with that. But there is a difference between loneliness and being alone. Back to the side.
I grew up as an only child. My uncles and aunts were in India, and my parents in California, and I was in England, and I was in those planes all the time. I just love, and I'm completely in my element, being by myself. And I'm only lonely when I'm in company. And that's unusual, but it's not that rare. I think a lot of people, I was just reading a book actually, it's the book by Susan Cain on introversion that is almost number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, pointing out how there's such an emphasis on the brassier forms of extroversion. We forget that so many of the great creators were in fact spent a lot of time by themselves, and one symptom she finds of introversion is that you actually prefer being alone to being in groups. But I was gratified in reading it to see that I'm in a lot of company in that. Maybe, she says, it could be half the country who's like that, although we're sometimes shy about acknowledging it to ourselves. So I feel most companioned and richest when I'm alone, and partly when I'm totally by myself, I feel I have so much to give to my friends. I'm bubbling over with things I want to share to them, say to them, email to them. I'm going to the laptop in those moments, and I feel richly connected with the world. And sometimes when I'm in a social situation where things aren't going so well, I feel disconnected from everything, so nothing to offer really.
I was wondering if you think it's possible that the stage that we're in right now with society, technologically speaking, is kind of an awkward in-between letting our hair grow out stage. That we are on our way toward Ray Kurzweil's singularity, and there is some kind of nirvana we don't even know about yet.
Thank you. That's a wonderful idea. And exactly, none of us knows where we're going. And it's risky to be too gloomy, as perhaps I have been, because you're absolutely right. And I think humanity always finds its balance one way or another. You cited Pascal. If you read Thoreau in Walden, he was saying word for word some of the things people like me are saying now. He was so terrified when trains and the telegrams came into the east coast of America, and he thought that was the end of humanity, and of course it wasn't. So I think humans are always worried about certain things, and most of those worries never come true. And indeed, this may be an evolutionary stage rather than a stage of confusion. And I'm interested in the child of tomorrow precisely because my sense is that people my age are feeling that we're ODing. And so the child of tomorrow will probably come up with a much more constructive resolution to this. We'll both feel absolutely at home with all these machines and machines we can't even dream of, and yet also know how to turn them to even better advantage and maybe towards something more utopian. So I haven't read Ray Kurzweil's book, though I've heard a lot about it, and Kevin Kelly's book I was just reading about technology invokes the singularity. But you're right, we don't know what's coming down, but it's certainly, I don't think it's apocalyptic, and it would be wonderful if it's utopian.
I'm curious about how you like to communicate. Do you write letters by hand? Do you write emails? How do you talk to people in life? And also, how do you talk to yourself? Do you write a journal, or how do you do that?
Yes, so I think you know my secrets already, because I do write everything by hand. In a hand I can't even read myself. A lot of my most exciting word choices come from misreading my handwriting. My PDA is this, and luckily you're too far away to see, but it's a hideous scroll, and you can't read a single word in it. And I can read 2 words out of 20, maybe, in it. And I think that's only because, generational thing. I grew up in England, where in my day you never learned to type. I had never composed on a keyboard until email came in. So with many, many friends, I do communicate by mail, snail mail, and most of those friends have chosen it. They somehow feel, and one of them wrote me a letter a couple of weeks ago that expressed it beautifully about how when he gets a letter, he sits with it and he goes back over it and he tries to see the words that are crossed out, and he takes a walk, and he realizes he can spend any time in the next 3 months, he can answer it, and he waits until he's in just the right place, and then he leisurely writes an answer, and then maybe doesn't send it for a couple of weeks. And he beautifully described the difference between that and email, which to me is a bit like washing the dishes. I mean, I do most of my communication by necessity by email, But I only go online once a day, at the end of the day when I've finished my writing. And then there are lots of emails waiting for me, people pouring out their hearts, telling me their secrets, sending me their holiday photos, editors with complaints and requests, all kinds of things, people forwarding things that I might never want to read. It's all coming in on me, so it's suddenly like being airlifted from the monastery into Times Square. And then my impulse is just to try and get through them as quickly as possible and then go back out and take a walk. So I try and deal with it that way, which isn't the best way. But I do notice that whenever a friend sends me a letter, I wait for the perfect moment, and things build up in me ever more gradually and ever more powerfully till suddenly they come out. And because there's no time frame and no deadline and no sense of necessity in some ways, I think a very different self comes out. Both a different self comes out if you're doing this from if you're doing that, and just by the nature of the beast. That it's a message out of time to another message out of time, and that inherently has a different quality from those rather time-riddled messages. I think many of my friends are wiser than I, so they send leisurely letters by email, and their friends treat those emails the way my friends treat letters. In other words, sit on them and think about them and reply at the perfect moment. But I somehow have got into this agitated state where every email that comes, I feel I have to answer instantly. And so I can never really do justice to the people who write to me by email.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And it's interesting, so many of my friends are really a little sorry that soon planes are going to be wireless, because so many people, I mean, it looks like you feel the same way, think that this is the one time nobody can get to me, nobody can get at me, I can do anything I want for the next 10 or 15 hours. That said, I always take a couple of books on a plane, but I'm careful about which carriers I use. And if I go on, for example, Singapore Airlines, which is so good, I look at that screen, 400 movies are available, and at last, my books can't begin to compete. I go with 2 books I'm dying to read, but when there are 400 movies, including ones that I know will never come to the theaters in Japan or Santa Barbara, I'm hostage to it. So I realize how books are fighting a very, very losing battle. I was in Kauai 3 or 4 months ago, I think just before I last saw you, and I was in a little town of Hanalei in the North Shore, which is sort of secluded, magical spot, a bit like Big Sur. And I was with my wife, and we went to have a cup of coffee. And there was a lovely notice there saying, please enjoy the moment, not the email. Hanalei is a completely wireless spot in the sense that there's no internet connection in the whole of this town. So please surrender to the beauty of the elements. It's a very inspiring thing. Right across from there, 20 yards away, was another coffee shop saying free Wi-Fi. So maybe the first one was 3 months earlier, but very soon that dream got punctured, even if the notice were still up.
And the article was for Financial Times?
My goodness.
Yeah.
You know
I
more
pay
about my
attention
writing than I did. Yeah, that one only came out last week.
Yeah.
Did I mention? I did mention maybe the Hanalei. Did I? Yes, I did. That's right.
You mentioned when I saw you at KCRW, but,
Oh,
but
did I?
my
Yes.
spies told me they saw this story last week. And you can all find it too.
See, it's a place to be connected. You know much more about things than I do.
Yes, but I'm suffering as a result of it. Not reading your writing, of course, but everything else is cascading on me.
Before this gentleman asked his question, when you were asking about planes, I was once interviewing, just as you are me, the wise French monk Mathieu Ricard,
Yes.
who, like the Dalai Lama, he's a translator for the Dalai Lama, as you know, spends all his time traveling around, and it's absolutely serene and clear. So I asked him, what is your cure for jet lag? And I've asked the Dalai Lama variations of that, because he doesn't suffer from jet lag. His body shows the symptoms of being 16 hours out of sync, but his mind much less so. And Mathieu wonderfully said, oh my goodness, when I'm in a plane, it's like a beautiful retreat in the sky. I don't have to do anything. I don't have any obligations. I just look out at the blue outside, and it's like a free meditation period. And I thought, there's an enlightened man. I mean, he's not flying Singapore Airlines for sure. I thought, well, it's a good way to look at the flying experience.
Your comment about Big Sur and the Sahara place reminds me of a moment in Jack Kerouac's book on Big Sur when he confronts the Pacific and he finds himself in a state of absolute terror. At the chaos of the ocean, world cannot be managed. In your magnificent inventory of rhetorical techniques for providing this kind of series of harmonious viewpoints that you have, I'm wondering how you deal with the kind of chaos, anger, fury, and terror that seem to be so overwhelming in the world today. After a 20th century which saw the greatest loss of life on the part of human beings and the greatest cruelty the world has ever seen. So how do you confront that along with all the techniques that you've been talking about for dealing with the better
Yes.
parts of the world?
Wonderful. Thank you. That's really one of the deepest, most thoughtful questions I've heard in a long time. And I've always been fascinated by that Kerouac book because I see it as the perfect counterpoint and complement to Henry Miller. And it's exactly what An Empty Space is about. One person finds absolute gold and clarity in it, and another person finds terror in exactly that same space. And I must say, when I'm in that Big Sur room by myself, and it's often a trailer on a hill, and many times in the middle of winter it's pouring with rain and there's a very heavy fog, you can't see a single other human habitation, I regard it as being like 40 days in the wilderness, as a place of absolute terror. Biblical kind of terror. And you can see how, whether it's Jesus or the Buddha or anyone who's sitting alone in a space like that is going to entertain as many devils as angels. One of my favorite lines, which I cite in my most recent book, is from The Cloud of Unknowing, the great 15th century mystical text, which says, the devil has his contemplatives as well as God. And when I'm in those spaces, it seems kind of naked, defenseless, nothing is protecting you. You're at the mercy of the elements, and as you say, you're at the mercy of chaos. It's really terrifying. And I'm so grateful to face it in that environment, A, because it's a protected environment, B, because I have to look head on at it in a way that I wouldn't if I was surrounded by the ways of distracting myself or hiding from myself that I have at home. In terms of the global picture, I think what I've made it my self-imposed mission to do is, I spend most of my time trying to look at those places furthest away from the peace of Big Sur or Japan. So whether it's Yemen or Haiti or Ethiopia or Bolivia, at the end of the last century, when we were told that technology was that Silicon Valley was the unacknowledged legislator of mankind, and I thought, well, I should go to the poorest places and see what 98% of my neighbors in the global neighborhood are confronting. And I think that's one of the things we can do now that previous generations couldn't. It both makes you more optimistic about your own life, at least you appreciate more the things that you take for granted, but as you, I think, also suggest, makes you see these unavoidable conflicts to which there seems to be no resolution. In this century, just before, 5 weeks before 2001, I was in Aden, the port in southern Yemen, where the USS Cole had just been blown up, and where, of course, AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, is now making headway. And on the one hand, it was so wonderful to visit Yemen 5 weeks before 2001, so that when we heard that Yemen was a terrorist threat, I could remember the 23 million people there who only want to come to America and only want to make friends with America. But on the other hand, it was really useful to see what the other half of the equation looked like. And so this century I've been especially spending time in the Middle East, Jerusalem, Beirut, and Damascus in particular, but Oman, Yemen, Syria, Jordan, quite a lot also. And when you go to a place like Jerusalem and you see our visions of holiness in hourly conflict with our humanness, to the point where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, one of the most exalted places in Christendom, is owned by 6 different denominations that are literally smashing each other with brooms and sometimes coming to almost all-out war against one another, though they follow the same God. The Franciscans hitting the Greek Orthodox and the Greek Orthodox hitting the Armenians and the Ethiopians and the Egyptian Copts and Syrian Christians fighting one another in the same building. It's a reminder that easy answers aren't going to come quickly. And a reminder, too, of what I think Graham Greene got as well as anybody in The Quiet American, which is for all the wonderful ideas that we can have for peace here at a distance, it's very, very difficult to bring them to those places where people have been fighting their own brothers for thousands of years. And I think that's one thing I admire about the Dalai Lama, that he always says he has no interest really in peace treaties, and even conferences about peace he will usually attend, but he says it's not much good if we just come up with a list of promises or golden rules, because everybody knows the 10 Commandments and the golden rule already. The only thing that's worthwhile is when one person decides to changed the way he acts a little bit. And I think he's been very excited by what Desmond Tutu has affected in those ways, because there you can actually see two enemies come into the same room and sometimes, in small ways, come out not as enemies. But there's no doubting the huge problems that we face. So whether it's a solitary in his cell or the world all connected, it's, as you say, by no means all peace and quiet. But I think quiet, my sense is the best way we can prepare ourselves for those realities. And that if we're caught up in the flurry of Times Square, then there's no chance that we can take the larger picture. Because when I was talking about Indra's net and those kind of ideas, you can only see that when you compose yourself in some ways. And then, of course, trying to act on that and bring that into a contentious situation is another thing and a difficult thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa.